The morning sun cast long shadows across Crow's Landing's dusty main street when Father Mackenzie pushed open the heavy oak doors of St. Mary's Church. What greeted him froze the blood in his veins. Two small figures huddled against the stone steps like broken dolls, their bodies trembling with more than cold. The girl couldn't be more than 4, her blonde hair matted with dirt and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. She clutched a torn piece of cloth to her chest, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs that spoke of terror too deep for words. Beside her sat a boy, perhaps 5, his darker skin revealing mixed Lakota and white heritage. His dark eyes darted frantically between the empty street and the church doors, as if expecting death to emerge from either direction. "Ate, ate," the boy whispered in Lakota, his voice barely audible as he pulled the girl closer. "Winona iyokipi sni, nape mayuza yo." Father. "Sister, don't be afraid. Hold my hand." Between them lay a crimson-stained rag, wet enough to glisten in the morning light. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the children's unwashed bodies and the acrid smell of smoke that clung to their torn clothing. Father Mackenzie's stomach churned as he realized whatever violence had torn these children from their lives had happened recently, perhaps within hours. The priest's hand trembled as he reached toward them, but the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks made him freeze. Townspeople were emerging from homes and businesses, and their morning routines interrupted by the sight of abandoned children. Their faces transformed from curiosity to disgust to naked fear as they recognized the boy's mixed heritage. "Goddamn half-breeds," someone muttered from across the street. "Probably brought Indians down on us." A woman pulled her own child closer, whispering, "Don't look at them, Mary. They're not our kind." The boy Eli pressed his sister against the church wall, his small body forming a shield as his whispered Lakota grew more urgent. "Winosa nape mayuzayo, ayokipi sniyo." "Little sister, hold my hand. Don't be afraid." Ada's blue eyes, wide with terror, met Father Mackenzie's across the growing crowd. Those eyes held the same devastating loss the priest had seen in battlefield survivors, the look of a child who had watched their world end in blood and violence. Not one soul stepped forward to help. Martha Jenkins had been delivering flour to kitchens since before most of Crow's Landing's residents drew breath. At 60, her weathered hands could still grip a 50-pound sack with strength that shamed men half her age, her spine straight, despite decades of ranch work that had buried lesser souls. She wore her steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her faded calico dress protected by a flour-dusted apron that had seen 1,000 meals prepared. The townspeople called her difficult, unnatural for a woman her age. Martha had buried her husband 15 years ago, lost her only child to scarlet fever shortly after, and turned away every suitor who darkened her doors since. She ran her small ranch alone, cooked for the bigger spreads when they needed extra hands, and spoke her mind about the corruption festering in town like gangrene. Sheriff Bartley was a snake who'd sell his own mother for the right price. Mayor Collins couldn't spell his own name without help. Half the town council were thieves in everything but name. Martha had said as much publicly, earning herself a reputation as a troublemaker who didn't know her place. But Martha Jenkins had learned long ago that sometimes trouble was the only thing standing between right and wrong. She rounded the corner toward the church, her boots clicking against the wooden walkway, when she saw the crowd forming. Not helping, never helping, just watching like vultures circling carrion. Then she saw what held their attention. The children sat like discarded playthings against the stone steps, their small bodies rigid with terror, so profound it seemed to radiate from them in waves. When the girl's eyes met Martha's across the street, something inside the older woman's chest cracked open like an egg. Those eyes held the same soul-deep loss Martha had seen in her own mirror after burying her daughter Emma, the look of innocence murdered by an indifferent world. Without conscious thought, Martha set down her flour sack and strode across the street. The crowd parted automatically. Even those who called her difficult respected the force of her presence. She knelt before the children, her apron spreading around her like protective wings. "I'm Martha," she said, her voice carrying the gentle tone she'd once used with Emma. "What are your names?" The boy's grip tightened on the girl's hand. "I'm Eli." He whispered, his pronunciation careful and precise. "This is Ada. We ain't got nowhere to go." Martha's jaw clenched as she took in their condition, the blood, the terror, the way they flinched at every sound. The torn clothing suggested they'd been dragged or thrown. Ada's left wrist showed finger-shaped bruises. Someone had hurt these children deliberately, then abandoned them like unwanted animals. "Well," Martha said, using her apron to gently wipe Ada's tear-streaked face, "I reckon you do now." A shadow fell across them. Martha looked up to see a man she didn't recognize, Lakota, middle-aged, wearing worn buckskin mixed with white man's clothing. He walked with a pronounced limp, his weathered face marked by lines that spoke of hard living and harder choices. Most white folks in Crow's Landing would have crossed 3 streets to avoid him. Martha had never been most white folks. Chaska Black Elk had been walking these frontier towns for 3 years, ever since his exile from the Lakota Nation. The decision that had cost him his place among his people still burned in his chest like a festering wound. When the war chiefs had planned their cattle raid against the white ranchers, Chaska had refused to participate, arguing that more bloodshed would only bring swift and brutal retaliation against their people. His words had fallen on deaf ears. The raid had proceeded, and when the white cavalry came seeking revenge, Chaska's predictions had proven tragically accurate. Entire families had been slaughtered in retaliation. The war chiefs had branded him a coward, a traitor to his own blood, and young warriors had encouraged his departure with clubs and knives. The injury to his left leg had come during that encouragement. Now he wandered between towns, taking whatever work he could find, trying to prove his worth to a world that saw him as neither fully Lakota nor acceptable to white society. But when he saw the boy Eli, something in his chest tightened like a fist. The child's mixed heritage was obvious in his features, the same burden Chaska had watched tear apart families and communities. The boy's dark eyes held the confusion of someone caught between 2 worlds belonging fully to neither. The boy, Chaska, said carefully, his English heavily accented but clear, "He speaks Lakota, but his blood is mixed." Martha studied the man's face, seeing something she recognized, the loneliness of an outcast and the weight of rejection by one's own people. "You know about that kind of burden." It wasn't a question. Chaska nodded slowly. "I know what it means to belong nowhere." The sound of approaching boots made them both look up. Sheriff Bartley was pushing through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun holster in a way that suggested eagerness rather than caution. Martha had tangled with Bartley before over his selective enforcement of the law, and she could read the calculation in his pale eyes like words on a page. "Well, well," Bartley said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never been legitimately challenged. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation here." Martha had heard the stories about the mining camp orphanage from Mrs. Kowalski, whose nephew had been sent there 5 years ago. The boy had lasted 3 months before dying of lung fever, though the bruises on his body when they sent him home for burial told a different story. Children worked 14-hour days in the mines, were beaten for speaking their native languages, and died at rates that made even hardened frontier folks whisper in horror. "These children need proper processing," Bartley announced, his voice carrying across the watching crowd. "Can't have strays cluttering up the church steps. I'll arrange transport to the mining camp orphanage up north." Martha felt her blood turn to ice. "Like hell you will." "Now, Martha," Bartley said, his hand moving closer to his gun, "don't go making this harder than it needs to be. These ain't your concern." "They are now." Martha rose to her feet, her body forming a human shield between the children and the sheriff. "These babies aren't going to that death trap you call an orphanage." The crowd murmured, sensing blood in the water. Some looked uncomfortable. Even the hardest hearts in Crow's Landing had heard the whispered stories about the mining camp. But others nodded approvingly, believing that half-breed children deserved whatever fate awaited them. Bartley's face darkened like a thundercloud. "You're interfering with official business, Martha. I can arrest you for obstruction. Try it." Martha said, her voice dropping to a growl that would have made her prize bull step back. "But you'll have to explain to the whole town why you're so eager to send babies to their graves." Chaska had been watching the exchange with growing tension. He recognized the look in Bartley's eyes, the same cold calculation he'd seen in white officials who'd promised peace while sharpening their knives in the shadows. The boy behind Martha reminded him too much of his own childhood, caught between worlds, unwanted by both. "I will share the responsibility," Chaska said, suddenly stepping forward, despite the pain shooting through his injured leg. "The woman speaks truth. These children deserve better than death." Bartley's hand moved to his gun grip. "A squaw man and an Indian lover. Figures you'd side together against decent folk. Choose your words carefully, Sheriff." Martha said, her voice carrying a warning sharp as winter wind. "There's a crowd watching, and some of them still remember when this town had honor." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Bartley's eyes darted between Martha's determined face and Chaska's steady gaze, then to the crowd where Father Mackenzie had moved closer, his clerical collar adding weight to Martha's position. A few of the townspeople looked genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of forcing children into what everyone knew was a death sentence. Finally, Bartley stepped back, but his retreat felt more like a tactical withdrawal than surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying promises of future retribution. "But they're your responsibility now. Any problems, any trouble they bring to this town, and I'll hold both of you accountable." He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising. "You all heard them take responsibility. Remember that when things go sideways." As Bartley pushed through the crowd and disappeared down the street, Martha felt the weight of what she'd committed to settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She looked at Chaska, this stranger who'd stepped forward to help, and saw the same understanding in his dark eyes. "I'm Martha Jenkins," she said formally. "I run a small ranch 2 miles outside town." "Chaska Black Elk," he replied, his voice carrying the dignity of a man who'd lost everything but his honor. "I have no home, but I know work." Martha looked down at the children, still huddled together on the church steps. Ada had stopped crying, but her grip on Eli's hand remained desperate. The boy watched the adults with the wary intelligence of someone who'd learned early that the world could turn dangerous without warning. "Well then," Martha said, her voice regaining its practical tone, "I reckon we better get these children home." 2 days after taking in the children, Martha discovered the true cost of her defiance. News traveled fast in Crow's Landing, carried by tongues that moved quicker than prairie fire. By sunset of the first day, every household in town knew that Martha Jenkins had taken in the abandoned half-breeds, and worse, she'd partnered with a Lakota man to do it. The whispers started immediately growing more vicious with each retelling. "Half-breed bastards," they said. "Probably brought trouble down on their own folks." The more creative voices suggested that Martha had lost her mind, that grief over her dead daughter had finally driven her to madness. Martha's ranch sat on good grazing land, a modest spread with a house she'd built herself after her husband's death. The main building was solid timber and stone designed to withstand harsh frontier weather and the occasional Indian raid. A barn housed her livestock, and a small garden provided vegetables for her table. She'd settled the children in her own bedroom, giving them the comfort of her best quilts and the safety of thick walls. Ada had barely spoken since the church steps, but she'd eaten the beef stew Martha prepared, and color was returning to her pale cheeks. Eli had been more talkative, his English mixed with Lakota phrases that Chaska translated when needed. "She's afraid of the dark," Eli whispered to Martha on the second night, his small hand protective on Ada's shoulder. She thinks the bad men will come back. Sometimes, Uncle William. Takoza Sika. Ada murmured in her sleep, her small fist clenched around the torn cloth she still carried. Uncle William. Bad man. Martha exchanged glances with Chaska, who was mending harness leather by lamplight. The children had mentioned no relatives, no Uncle William, in their sparse conversations about their past. Dreams, Chaska said quietly. Children speak truth in dreams. But Martha filed the name away, a puzzle piece that didn't yet fit the picture they were trying to assemble. The first economic blow came the next morning. Mrs. Henderson arrived with her empty pie basket and a face full of regret, unable to meet Martha's eyes. I can't buy from you anymore, Martha. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. My husband says it's bad for business associating with your situation. Martha had expected this, but it still stung like a slap. Those pie sales had provided crucial income for feed supplies and the small luxuries that made frontier life bearable. I understand, she said quietly. You got your own family to think about. Mrs. Henderson climbed back into her wagon, then paused. For what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong. Those children deserve better than the mining camp. But, she shrugged helplessly. This town's got a long memory for grudges. The boycott spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, Martha couldn't sell a single pie jar of preserves or bushel of vegetables. The general store owner, emboldened by community support, began refusing to sell to her entirely. When Chaska ventured into town for supplies, he faced a gauntlet of hostility that went beyond mere prejudice. Men would step into his path, forcing him to walk around them. Others would spit at his feet or mutter curses about savage half-breeds. Tom Bradley, 3 sheets to the wind outside the saloon, had thrown a bottle that shattered against the wall inches from Chaska's head. Then you bring them kind into town. Bradley had slurred, you invite trouble. That buck's probably sending smoke signals to his warrior friends. Chaska had responded with silence. But Martha saw the tension in his shoulders when he returned to the ranch. The isolation was wearing on all of them. 1 week after the barn fire, Martha was leaving the doctor's office after getting her arthritic hands examined, when 3 men cornered her in the alley beside the building. Harry Simmons, Pete Kowalski, and Tom Bradley, all regulars at the saloon, and known for their mean streaks when liquored up. You caused us a lot of trouble, Martha. Harry said, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. Them kids got people stirred up, worried about Indian raids coming down on the whole town. Those children are 5 and 4 years old. Martha replied, her hand moving instinctively to the skinning knife she kept in her apron. They couldn't raid a cookie jar, much less threaten grown men. But their people could, Pete interjected, stepping closer. You bring them kind into town, you invite every savage from here to the Dakotas. And that buck you're living with, he's probably already sent word to his tribe. Martha's temper flared like gunpowder. Chaska was exiled from his tribe for refusing to fight white men. He's got no more love for raiders than you do. Once a savage, always a savage. Tom said, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. And you're a fool if you think different. The confrontation might have escalated to violence if Dr. Morrison hadn't emerged from his office, his medical bag in hand, and concern written across his weathered face. The 3 men dispersed like smoke, but their message was clear. Martha and Chaska were living on borrowed time. That evening, Martha sat on her porch watching the children play in the yard. Ada was beginning to laugh again, her resilience slowly overcoming the trauma of abandonment. Eli had appointed himself her protector, staying close whenever strangers approached and teaching her simple Lakota words for animals and plants. Sunka, he would say, pointing to their old dog. Sunka waste. Dog. Good dog. Ada would repeat the words carefully, her pronunciation improving daily. The language lessons seemed to calm both children, connecting them to something larger than their current circumstances. Chaska approached from the ruins of the barn, where he'd been salvaging what lumber he could. His limp was more pronounced in the evenings, the old injury aggravated by physical labor. "The children are healing," he observed, settling beside her despite the pain in his leg. "They're strong," Martha agreed, watching Ada chase fireflies, while Eli stayed protectively close. "Stronger than most adults I know. But they carry scars. Ada still wakes crying some nights. Eli watches the horizon like he expects enemies to appear." Martha nodded. She'd noticed the same things, the way Ada flinched at sudden noises, how Eli positioned himself between the adults and any potential threats. Whatever had happened to them before their abandonment had left wounds that might never fully heal. "We need to know more about their past," Martha said. "About what brought them to that church." Chaska was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes the past is better left buried, not when it might come looking for us. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Both adults tensed, but these riders came openly without masks or torches. Father Mackenzie led the group, accompanied by 3 other men, Martha recognized as reasonable members of the community. "Martha," the priest said, dismounting with obvious reluctance, "we need to talk." The delegation's message was simple, but ominous, and the town was dividing over the children's presence. Some supported their right to sanctuary, but others were calling for more direct action. There were rumors of a larger group forming plans for a more serious confrontation than the barn burning. "We're not asking you to abandon them," Father Mackenzie said carefully, his clerical collar seeming to weigh heavy on his shoulders. "But perhaps they'd be safer somewhere else, away from all this tension." Martha's jaw tightened like a steel trap. "Where would you suggest, Father, that mining camp death trap? There are other places. Mission schools back east. Places where they'd be separated, where Eli would be beaten for speaking his mother's language, and Ada would be taught to hate her own brother's blood." The priest had no answer for that. The delegation left with polite words and worried faces, but Martha knew they'd delivered their real message. The situation was escalating beyond their control. That night, as Martha and Chaska took turns keeping watch, they discussed their dwindling options. They could take the children, and head for California or Oregon Territory. They could surrender, let the town have its way, and hope the children survived whatever came next. Or they could stay and fight, knowing the odds were stacked against them like a rigged deck. "I've been running for 3 years," Chaska said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. "Always moving, always hiding, never standing for anything worth fighting for. These children, they're worth standing for." Martha looked at him with new respect. "You know what we're up against. Half the town wants us gone, and the other half is too scared to help. Then we make our stand with what we have. What we have is an old woman with arthritis, a lame Indian, and 2 babies who've already seen too much violence." Chaska's smile was grim but determined. "Then we'd better be smarter than they are." 3 weeks after taking in the children, Martha was mending Ada's torn dress when her fingers found something unexpected, a piece of paper hidden in a secret pocket sewn into Eli's small jacket. The sewing was professional, done by someone who knew their craft, and the pocket was concealed well enough that it had escaped notice during their first examination of the children's belongings. The paper was a wanted poster, professionally printed, but weathered from handling. The face staring back at her was familiar: William O'Dowd, owner of the largest mine in the territory, and one of the most powerful men in the region. The charges listed were fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, with a reward of $500 for information leading to his arrest. But it was the note folded inside the poster that made Martha's blood run cold. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. If something happens to me, know that the children are O'Dowd's bastards. He had their mother killed when she threatened to expose him. The woman was Lakota name of Running Deer. She worked in his house, and he got her with child twice. When she demanded he acknowledge them, he had her murdered. I tried to save the kids, but his men found me. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. The children are the only proof of what he's done. Guard them with your life. J. Murphy. Martha felt the world tilt around her like a ship in a storm. These weren't random abandoned children, they were the illegitimate offspring of one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the territory. Their mother had been murdered to protect O'Dowd's reputation, and someone named J. Murphy had died trying to save them. Chaska. She called, her voice tight with shock. You need to see this. Chaska read the note twice, his weathered face growing darker with each word. This changes everything, he said quietly. These children aren't just unwanted, they're evidence of murder. And if O'Dowd finds out they're alive, he'll kill them, and us. Chaska's hand moved instinctively to his knife. Men like O'Dowd don't leave loose ends. Martha stared at the wanted poster, understanding flooding through her like ice water. O'Dowd's wealth and influence made him untouchable within the territory, but this poster suggested he was wanted by federal authorities. Someone outside his sphere of corruption was looking for him. The bloodied rag, she said suddenly. On the church steps, that was from Murphy's murder. Someone was trying to get the children away from O'Dowd's men. And now he knows they survived. Chaska added grimly. Sheriff Bartley's eagerness to send them to the mining camp makes sense now. He's on O'Dowd's payroll. The implications were staggering. They weren't just fighting town prejudice. They were standing against a criminal empire that had already committed murder to protect itself. O'Dowd would have resources, hired guns, and the protection of corrupted officials. But there was something else, something that made Martha's skin crawl. She remembered Ada's whispered words in her sleep. Uncle William, tacos asika. Now she understood the children knew O'Dowd. He'd been part of their lives before their abandonment. We should run, Martha said. But even as she spoke, she knew it was impossible. Take the children and get as far away as we can. Chaska shook his head. Men like O'Dowd have long reaches. We'd be running forever, always looking over our shoulders. Then what do you suggest? We fight, but not alone. Chaska held up the wanted poster. This says federal authorities want him. We need to get word to someone outside the territory. Martha considered this. Father Mackenzie has contacts in the church hierarchy. Might be able to get a message to federal marshals. Might, Chaska agreed. But that takes time, and I don't think we have much. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the evening air. But this wasn't the thunder of many riders or the stealthy approach of night raiders. It was a small group riding openly, but with purpose. Martha and Chaska exchanged glances. They both knew, without being told, that their secret was out. William O'Dowd was a man who commanded respect through fear and money. In his mid-50s, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged. His clothes were expensive, Eastern tailoring. His horse was the finest money could buy. And his two companions were clearly skilled killers. Mrs. Jenkins O'Dowd said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Boston education mixed with frontier steel. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Martha stepped forward, her hand resting on her apron where she kept her knife. I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. O'Dowd. William O'Dowd. His smile was cold as winter snow. And I think you know exactly why I'm here. Chaska moved to Martha's side, his presence adding weight to their defiance. The two gunmen shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons with practiced ease. I'm here to collect my property. O'Dowd continued, his voice reasonable, but his eyes hard as flint. 2 children who were stolen from my care. Those children aren't property. Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. They're human beings with a right to safety. O'Dowd's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. I'm afraid you're mistaken. Those children are my responsibility, and I've come to take them to their proper home. Which would be where? Chaska asked, his voice carrying quiet menace. The mining camp, or somewhere more permanent? O'Dowd's composure cracked slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. I don't know what lies you've been told, but I assure you I have only the children's best interests at heart. Like you had their mother's best interests at heart? Martha asked. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. O'Dowd's face hardened like cooling steel, and Martha knew they'd just signed their own death warrants. I see, O'Dowd said finally. You know more than is healthy for your continued existence. That's most unfortunate. One of the gunman's hands moved to his pistol, but the sound of a child's laughter from the house stopped him cold. Ada and Eli had been playing in the garden, protected by the adult's position between them and the visitors. Uncle William. Ada's voice carried across the yard, innocent and trusting. O'Dowd's face transformed like a mask being changed, becoming almost paternal. Hello, darling. Uncle William has come to take you home. Martha felt sick. The children knew him, trusted him. Whatever story he'd told them about their mother's disappearance, they believed it completely. We like it here, Eli said, stepping protectively in front of Ada. Even at 5, he sensed the danger in the situation, like a young animal scenting a predator. I'm sure you do, O'Dowd said gently, his voice taking on the tone adults used with beloved children. But it's time to come home. These people have been very kind, but you belong with family. Martha saw the conflict in the children's faces. They wanted to trust the familiar figure, but they'd also learned to trust her and Chaska. The tension was unbearable. The children are staying here, Martha said firmly. They're safe, they're cared for, and they're not going anywhere with you. O'Dowd's mask of paternal concern dropped like a stone. Mrs. Jenkins, I think you misunderstand your situation. I'm not asking. Neither am I, Martha replied. The standoff might have erupted into violence, but the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Sheriff Bartley was riding up with 2 deputies, their timing too perfect to be coincidental. Problem here, Mr. O'Dowd? Bartley asked, his question making clear whose side he was on. These people have kidnapped 2 children, O'Dowd said smoothly. I'm here to recover them. That's a lie, Martha said, but she knew it didn't matter. Bartley would support whatever story O'Dowd chose to tell. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to surrender the children. Bartley said, his hand resting on his gun. Mr. O'Dowd has legal custody. Since when? Chaska asked. Since I say so. Bartley replied, his smile as cold as his employer's. Martha felt the trap closing around them like steel jaws. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing corrupted authority. But surrender meant death for the children, and she'd promised to protect them. Well, we'll need to see those custody papers, she said, buying time. O'Dowd's smile was triumphant. Of course, I'll have them drawn up immediately. The message was clear. He could manufacture whatever legal documents he needed. Money and corruption would give him any authority he required. But as the confrontation stretched on, Martha noticed something that gave her hope. Father Mackenzie was approaching on foot, having left his horse at the road. The priest's presence might not change the immediate situation, but it meant there were witnesses to whatever happened next. Father, Martha called out, Mr. O'Dowd is here to collect the children. The priest's face showed confusion, then growing concern as he took in the scene, armed men, tense faces, and children caught in the middle. I was under the impression the children were abandoned. Father Mackenzie said carefully. A misunderstanding, O'Dowd replied smoothly. I've been searching for them since they went missing from their home. Martha caught the priest's eye and mouthed the word, Murphy. Father Mackenzie's face went pale. He understood the implication. Perhaps, the priest said slowly, we should wait until proper legal proceedings can be arranged. The children seem well cared for here. The children are coming with me. O'Dowd said, his voice hardening like cooling iron. Today, Martha realized they were out of time. The confrontation was escalating beyond words, and blood would be spilled within minutes. She looked at Chaska, seeing the same understanding in his eyes. Ada, Eli, she called softly. Come here, darlings. The children approached warily, sensing the tension like small animals sensing a storm. Martha knelt and gathered them close, her voice dropping to a whisper only they could hear. Whatever happens, you stay with Chaska. You run when he tells you to run, and you don't look back. Are we in trouble? Ada asked, her blue eyes wide with fear. No, baby. But some people want to hurt you, and we won't let that happen. O'Dowd's patience was exhausted. Enough of this charade. Sheriff, arrest these people for kidnapping. Bartley drew his gun, and Martha knew their time was up. But as she prepared to make her last stand, she saw something that filled her with desperate hope. Chaska had been quietly moving during the conversation, positioning himself between the children and O'Dowd's men. Now he caught Martha's eye and nodded toward the house. There was a plan forming a desperate gambit that might save the children, even if it cost their lives. You want them? Martha said, rising to her feet with dignity intact. You'll have to go through me. O'Dowd's smile was cold as winter. That can be arranged. Father Mackenzie's attempt to help came swiftly, but ended in brutal retaliation. The priest, driven by conscience and Martha's urgent whisper about Murphy, had ridden straight to town after the confrontation. He'd composed a carefully worded telegram to federal authorities in Denver, detailing his suspicions about O'Dowd's involvement in the children's abandonment and requesting immediate investigation. But O'Dowd's network of informants ran deeper than prairie routes. The telegraph operator bought and paid for, like so many others, delivered a copy of the message directly to O'Dowd's office within hours. The next morning, Father Mackenzie was found beaten unconscious behind his own church. His face was a mass of purple bruises, 3 ribs were broken, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Dr. Morrison worked for hours to stabilize him. But when the priest finally regained consciousness, his message was whispered through swollen lips. They said, next time, they'll finish the job. Martha received the news while tending to her small garden, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the children. Mrs. Henderson had brought word, her face pale with shock and fear. He's alive, Mrs. Henderson said quickly, but barely. And Martha, there's talk in town. They say you and the Indian are next. Martha's hands stilled on the tomato plants. What kind of talk? O'Dowd's men have been asking questions about your habits, your defenses when you're alone. Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper. They know about the weapons you keep, about how the Indian watches the roads. Martha stood slowly, her arthritic joints protesting. You shouldn't have come here. It's dangerous to be seen with me. I had to warn you. Mrs. Henderson climbed back into her wagon, then paused. There's something else. They found papers in the sheriff's office. Bartley's got the same last name as O'Dowd's mother, they're cousins. That's why he's been protecting him all these years. The news hit Martha like a physical blow. The corruption ran deeper than she'd imagined, connected by blood as well as money. After Mrs. Henderson left, Martha found Chaska teaching the children to identify edible plants near the creek. His instruction was disguised as a nature lesson, but she recognized the survival skills he was passing on, knowledge that might keep them alive if they had to flee into the wilderness. We need to talk, she said quietly. They sent Ada and Eli to collect eggs from the chicken coop. while the adults discussed their deteriorating situation. Father Mackenzie's beating had sent a clear message: anyone who helped them would face brutal consequences. "He's isolating us," Chaska observed, "cutting off our allies, making us vulnerable." "The telegram might have gotten through before they stopped him," Martha said hopefully. "And if it did, how long before federal marshals arrive? Days, weeks?" Chaska's face was grim. "O'Dowd won't wait. He knows we have evidence of his crimes." That evening, as dusk painted the sky, the color of old blood, their worst fears were realized. Chaska had gone to the creek to fetch water, avoiding the roads where O'Dowd's men might be waiting. But they'd been watching, learning his patterns. The attack came without warning. 3 men emerged from the cottonwoods as Chaska knelt by the water's edge, his guard down for just a moment. They moved with professional efficiency clubs and knives ready. "Where are the children?" the leader demanded, his voice muffled by a flour sack mask. Chaska's hand moved to his knife, but they were too close, too ready. The first blow caught him across the shoulders, driving him to his knees. The second opened a gash on his scalp that sent blood streaming down his face. "Tell us where they're hidden," another voice hissed. "Make this easy on yourself." Chaska's response was to grab a handful of creek mud and fling it into the nearest man's eyes. The brief distraction let him roll away from the next club swing, but his injured leg betrayed him. He stumbled, and they were on him like wolves on a wounded deer. The beating was methodical, professional. They wanted information, not death, not yet. But when Chaska refused to speak, refused to give them what they wanted, their patience wore thin. "Drown the bastard," one of them snarled. "See if that loosens his tongue." They dragged him into the deeper water, forcing his head under the surface. Chaska fought with desperate strength, but 3 against 1 was impossible odds. His lungs burned, his vision darkened, and he thought of Ada and Eli, of Martha, of the promise he'd made to protect them. Then his hand found a loose stone on the creek bottom, and he drove it into the nearest man's kneecap with everything he had left. The scream of pain was muffled by the water, but the grip on his head loosened enough for him to break free. Chaska surfaced, gasping, blood streaming from his scalp, his legs screaming in agony. But he was alive, and the element of surprise had shifted in his favor. He used his knowledge of the creek's currents and hidden depths to evade their pursuit, finally disappearing into the tall grass downstream. When he limped back to the ranch an hour later, soaked and bloodied, Martha took one look at him and knew their time was running out. "They know," he said simply. "They know we have the children, and they're coming for them." Martha cleaned his wounds by lamplight, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "How many?" 3 at the creek, but there will be more. O'Dowd's not taking chances anymore. "We need to get the children away from here," Martha said. "Tonight." But even as she spoke, they both knew it was too late. The sound of approaching horses was already audible in the distance, and this time there would be no talking, no negotiations. O'Dowd was coming to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes, and he was bringing an army to do it. "Get the children," Martha said, her voice steady despite everything. "And remember, whatever happens, they're worth fighting for." Chaska nodded, understanding the weight of her words. In the distance, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and Martha knew their final stand was about to begin. The storm that had been building all day finally broke as O'Dowd's army reached the ranch. Thunder crashed overhead like artillery, and the first drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust in the yard to treacherous mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the faces of 20 armed men who had come to commit murder. Martha had prepared as best she could. Every weapon on the ranch was loaded and ready, her Spencer rifle, a shotgun, and 2 revolvers her husband had left behind. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. They were facing professional killers, men who'd been paid well to ensure no witnesses survived. "This is your last warning," a voice called from the darkness. Marshal Crawford had arrived with 6 federal deputies, but they were vastly outnumbered. "You're interfering with a federal investigation." O'Dowd's laughter carried across the yard, cold and bitter. "Marshal, you're a long way from civilization, and you're badly outnumbered. Federal jurisdiction extends everywhere." Crawford replied, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. "Surrender now, and we'll consider that in your sentencing." "I'm afraid surrender isn't an option." O'Dowd said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd crossed too many lines to ever go back. "You see, there can't be any witnesses to what happens here tonight." Martha felt her blood chill. O'Dowd wasn't just planning to eliminate the children, he was prepared to kill federal officers to protect his secrets. The man had nothing left to lose. "You're talking about murdering federal marshals," Crawford said. "That's a hanging offense." "Only if there's anyone left to testify," O'Dowd replied. The rain began to fall harder, turning the afternoon into a gray, violent twilight. Martha could hear the children whimpering in the house behind her, and she knew they were reliving whatever trauma had brought them to the church steps. "Ada, Eli," she called softly. "Go to the back room like we practiced. Don't come out until we call for you." She heard small footsteps running across the wooden floors, then Chaska's voice, gentle but firm. "Remember what I taught you about being brave. Takoza nina watea ishinhanyo." "Children, be very careful." O'Dowd raised his hand, and Martha knew the talking was over. 20 armed men against 6 federal deputies, an aging ranch woman, and a wounded Lakota warrior. The odds were hopeless, but sometimes hopeless was all you had. "Take them," O'Dowd shouted. The world exploded into gunfire and chaos. Martha dove behind the porch railing as bullets splintered the wood around her, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Her Spencer rifle bucked in her hands as she returned fire, and she had the satisfaction of seeing one of O'Dowd's men tumble from his horse, clutching his shoulder. But for every shot she fired, a dozen came back. The sound was deafening: rifles, cracking pistols, barking men shouting orders and screaming in pain. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the ozone smell of the approaching storm. Chaska had positioned himself at the corner of the house, his rifle cracking steadily as he picked targets with the patience of a hunter. His wounded leg made movement difficult, but his aim was true. Another of O'Dowd's men fell, clutching his chest. Marshal Crawford and his deputies were giving a good account of themselves, but Martha could see they were being overwhelmed. The hired guns had spread out, using the storm and the gathering darkness to their advantage. "The old grain store," one of O'Dowd's men shouted. "Get behind the grain store." Martha cursed. The small building that had once stored winter feed for her animals still provided some cover, and if O'Dowd's men reached it, they'd have a perfect shooting position into the house. "Chaska," she called over the thunder and gunfire. "They're flanking us." But Chaska was already moving, his limp more pronounced, as he ran through the rain-soaked yard. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he kept moving. Martha watched in horror as he stumbled, his wounded leg giving out in the slick mud. "I'm hit," Deputy Morrison called from behind the well. "I'm hit bad." Martha could see the young deputy clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. They were losing people, and the fight had barely begun. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark detail. Men running, muzzle flashes, the growing puddles of rainwater turning pink with blood. The storm was getting worse, making visibility difficult for both sides. O'Dowd's voice carried across the chaos. "Burn them out, fire the house." Martha's heart stopped. If they fired the house, the children would be trapped inside. She had to stop them, whatever the cost. "Not my children," she screamed, abandoning her cover. Martha Jenkins, 60 years old and half crippled with arthritis, charged across the bullet-swept yard with her rifle blazing. She moved like a woman possessed, driven by a maternal fury that made her forget her own mortality. Her boots slipped in the mud, but she kept going, her voice rising above the thunder and gunfire. "You want them come through me." A bullet grazed her left arm, spinning her around. The pain was immediate and intense, but she kept moving. Another bullet shattered her rifle stock, leaving her armed with only her husband's old revolver. But she kept going, her finger working the trigger as fast as she could pull it. One of O'Dowd's men, startled by her charge, hesitated just long enough for Martha to put a bullet in his chest. He fell backwards into the mud, his torch extinguished by the rain. But Martha's heroic charge had left her exposed. 3 more guns swung toward her, and she knew she was about to die. Time seemed to slow as she saw the muzzle flashes, felt the bullets tear through the air around her. Then Chaska was there, throwing himself between Martha and the guns. The bullets meant for her took him instead, and he crumpled to the muddy ground with a cry of pain that cut through her heart like a knife. "No!" Martha screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Chaska, no!" Blood was spreading across his chest, mixing with the rain. His breathing was labored, and Martha could see the light fading from his eyes. "The children," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Keep them safe. Don't you die on me," Martha said fiercely, pressing her hands against his wounds. "Don't you dare die on me." But even as she spoke, she knew more of O'Dowd's men were closing in. Marshal Crawford was down, clutching his leg. Half the deputies were wounded or dead. The house was surrounded, and it was only a matter of time before someone got through with a torch. That's when Martha heard it, the sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Ada was screaming, Mama Martha, help us." The children's hiding place had been discovered. Through the shattered windows of the house, Martha could see one of O'Dowd's men dragging Ada and Eli from the back room. The little girl was fighting desperately, her small fists beating against her captor's arms. Eli was trying to protect her, but he was only 5 years old. "Let them go," Martha roared, struggling to her feet. "They're babies." O'Dowd appeared in the doorway, his expensive clothes muddy and torn. In his hand was a pistol, and it was pointed at Ada's head. "Enough," he shouted. "Everyone stop shooting." The gunfire died away, leaving only the sound of rain and Martha's ragged breathing. O'Dowd stepped onto the porch, using the children as human shields. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Everyone throws down their weapons, or the children die." Martha felt the world collapsing around her. After everything they'd been through, after all the sacrifices, O'Dowd was going to win. The children would die, and their mother's murder would go unpunished. "You're making a mistake," Marshal Crawford called out, his voice strained with pain. "Kill those children, and you'll hang for sure." "I'm already dead," O'Dowd replied, his mask of civilization finally slipping completely. "My empire is finished, my reputation destroyed. But I'll be damned if I let these bastards testify against me." Ada was crying now, her small body shaking with terror. Eli stood as straight as he could, trying to be brave, but Martha could see the fear in his dark eyes. "Please," Martha said, her voice breaking. "They're innocent. They've never hurt anyone. Their mother tried to destroy me." O'Dowd snarled, his face contorting with rage. "She threatened to expose our relationship, to ruin everything I'd built. These children are proof of my shame." Martha understood then. It wasn't just about the children's testimony, it was about O'Dowd's twisted pride. He'd rather commit murder than acknowledge his own blood. "You're their father," she said quietly. "How can you kill your own children?" O'Dowd's face turned purple with rage. "They're not my children. They're mistakes, reminders of a moment of weakness." The gun moved from Ada's head to Eli's, and Martha knew she was out of time. O'Dowd was going to pull the trigger, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. But as O'Dowd's finger tightened on the trigger, a shot rang out across the yard. The mine owner staggered, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Blood blossomed across his white shirt, and he looked down in shock. Behind him, in the doorway of the house, stood Deputy Williams, the youngest of Crawford's men, barely 20 years old. He'd been presumed dead, after taking a bullet in the first exchange, but he'd crawled into the house and waited for his chance. The federal officer, Williams, gasped his own wound, bleeding freely. "You're under arrest." But O'Dowd wasn't finished. Even dying, his eyes were fixed on the children with murderous intent. With his last breath, he reached for a hidden derringer in his coat. "If I can't have them," he wheezed, "no one can." The derringer rose, tracking toward the children. Martha saw the movement and knew she had only seconds to act. Without thinking, she threw herself between O'Dowd and the children. The bullet that would have killed Ada took Martha instead, punching through her chest and dropping her to the muddy ground. She felt the impact, felt the fire spreading through her body. But her only thought was for the children. "Are you hurt?" she gasped as Ada and Eli threw themselves into her arms. "Are you safe?" "We're okay, Mama Martha." Ada sobbed. "We're okay." O'Dowd toppled forward, his derringer falling from dead fingers. Around the yard, his surviving men were throwing down their weapons, their fight gone with their employer's death. But Martha barely noticed. She was focused on the children in her arms, on Chaska's labored breathing nearby, on the knowledge that they'd won, but at such a terrible cost. "The children," she whispered to Marshal Crawford as he limped over. "Keep them safe." "They're safe," Crawford assured her. "It's over. O'Dowd's dead, his men are surrendering. It's over." Martha closed her eyes, feeling the rain on her face. They'd won, but the victory felt hollow. Too many good people had died, and the children had seen too much violence. But they were alive. Ada and Eli were alive, and that was what mattered. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come, leaving the ranch yard muddy and blood-soaked under clearing skies. Dr. Morrison arrived with his medical bag, summoned by the sound of gunfire that had echoed across the territory. He worked frantically over the wounded, his skilled hands moving between federal officers and the two people who'd made their stand for justice. Martha's wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had missed her heart by inches, though it had shattered 2 ribs and caused significant blood loss. She drifted in and out of consciousness as the doctor worked, but her eyes always sought the children. Chaska's injuries were more severe. 3 bullets had found their mark, and he'd lost too much blood. Dr. Morrison worked over him with grim determination, but his prognosis was guarded. "He's strong," the doctor told Martha as she recovered. "The Lakota are tough people, and he's got reasons to live." Those reasons were sitting beside Martha's bed, where Ada and Eli had refused to leave her side. The children had been remarkably composed during the battle's aftermath, helping to tend wounds and comfort the injured with a maturity that broke Martha's heart. "We thought you were going to die," Ada said quietly, her small hand holding Martha's. "Like our first mama." "I'm too stubborn to die," Martha replied, managing a weak smile. "And I promise to keep you safe." Within days, federal investigators arrived to sort through the wreckage of O'Dowd's empire. The search of his office in town yielded a treasure trove of evidence, detailed ledgers of bribes paid to officials, records of murders committed to protect his interests, and correspondence that revealed the scope of his corruption. Sheriff Bartley was arrested, along with half the town council. The revelation of his family connection to O'Dowd explained his unwavering loyalty to the mine owner's criminal enterprise. The telegraph operator who'd betrayed Father Mackenzie was charged with obstruction of justice. The tentacles of O'Dowd's corruption reached into every corner of Crow's Landing. But the most important discovery came from O'Dowd's personal safe. Hidden behind false documents was a letter in his own handwriting, a confession written in a moment of drunken guilt. In it, he detailed the murder of Running Deer, the children's mother, and his plans to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes. "This closes the case," Marshal Crawford told Martha as she recovered. O'Dowd's death, combined with this confession, means justice for Running Deer and safety for the children. Father Mackenzie, his broken bones slowly healing, visited the ranch to deliver news from the outside world. The federal investigation had made headlines across the territory, and O'Dowd's criminal empire was being systematically dismantled. There's more, the priest said carefully. Running Deer's family has been found. Her brother Joseph Black Wolf survived the attack on their village. He's been searching for the children. Martha felt a chill of fear. After everything they'd been through, would the children be taken away from her? He's coming here, Father Mackenzie continued. He wants to meet the people who protected his sister's children. Joseph Black Wolf arrived a week later, a man in his 30s with the dignified bearing of a Lakota warrior. He wore traditional clothing mixed with white man's garments, and his English was careful but clear. Martha watched nervously as he approached the house, uncertain of his intentions. But when Eli ran to him speaking rapid Lakota, she saw the love in the man's eyes. "Lexi!" Eli cried. "Uncle!" Ada hung back shy with the stranger, but Joseph knelt and spoke to her in gentle tones. "I knew your mother," he said in English. "She was brave like you." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Joseph explained that he'd been searching for the children since their mother's death, following rumors and false leads across the territory. He'd never stopped believing they were alive. "I want to thank you," he said to Martha, his voice heavy with emotion. "My sister's children are healthy and happy. You kept them safe when their own people could not." "They're good children," Martha replied. "They've been through hell, but they're strong." Joseph looked at the children, then at Martha and the recovering Chaska. "I have a proposal," he said carefully. "In my tribe, we believe children need many parents, mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles, grandparents and teachers. These children have found good parents in you." Martha's heart leaped with hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Running Deer's children belong with the people who love them. If you'll have me, I'd like to be their uncle who visits, who teaches them about their mother's people. But their home is here with their chosen family." 3 months after the final battle, the town of Crow's Landing held its first public trial since the territorial court had been established. The courthouse was packed with townspeople who had come to witness justice being served, though many carried the shame of their earlier actions. Sheriff Bartley stood in chains before Judge Harrison, a federal judge brought in to ensure their impartiality. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The ledgers from O'Dowd's office witness testimony and his own family connection to the deceased crime boss. "The defendant is found guilty of corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to murder," Judge Harrison announced. "I sentence him to 20 years in federal prison." The crowd murmured, but there was no satisfaction in the verdict. Too many people had stood by while evil flourished in their midst. Martha attended the trial with the children, though she still walked with a cane from her injuries. Ada and Eli sat between her and Chaska, and their small hands holding tight to their chosen parents. The children had insisted on attending, wanting to see justice done for their mother. "Is the bad man gone now?" Ada asked as they left the courthouse. "Yes, baby," Martha replied. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." But the real healing came later in a private ceremony behind Martha's rebuilt house. Joseph Black Wolf had returned for the occasion, bringing with him a small leather pouch that contained earth from Running Deer's grave. "Your mother wanted you to know her stories," he said to the children, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. "She wanted you to know who you are." The children listened with wide eyes as Joseph told them about Running Deer's courage, her love for them, and the sacrifice she'd made, trying to protect them. When he finished, he handed them the pouch. "We will bury this under the oak tree," he said. "So your mother's spirit will always be with you." The ceremony was simple, but profound. The children dug a small hole beneath a massive oak that shaded Martha's yard, and their small hands working together. They placed the pouch carefully in the earth and then covered it with soil and stones they'd gathered from the creek. "Minakentawasakea," Eli whispered in Lakota. "Mother, I love you." Ada, still learning the language, simply pressed her small hand to the earth and said, "I love you first, Mama." Martha wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the children find their closure. They would always carry the scars of their early trauma, but they also carried the strength of their mother's love and the security of their chosen family. The townspeople's reaction to the children's presence had changed dramatically. The federal investigation had exposed the corruption that had poisoned their community, and many felt shame over their treatment of Martha and Chaska. A public apology was published in the territorial newspaper, signed by dozens of residents. Mrs. Henderson was among the first to return her pie basket in hand and tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I was afraid. But that's no excuse for abandoning what's right." Others followed. The general store owner began extending credit again. The blacksmith offered to repair Martha's damaged tools for free. The new preacher, replacing the one who'd been complicit in the town's corruption, invited Martha and Chaska to bring the children to Sunday services. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a beginning. Most importantly, the children were healing. Ada's nightmares were becoming less frequent, and her laughter was returning. Eli was learning to balance his protective instincts with the simple joys of childhood. Both children had begun calling Martha Mama and Chaska Papa, creating a family bound not by blood, but by love and shared trials. The new school that had been built to replace the corrupt institution of the past welcomed all children regardless of their heritage. Joseph Blackwolf had accepted the position of cultural teacher, helping to bridge the gap between white and Lakota communities. "Children," he told his mixed classes, "are the future of both our peoples. They carry the best of both worlds within them." 1 year after the battle that had changed everything, Martha stood in her rebuilt ranch, watching as her family prepared for a celebration. It was Ada's 5th birthday, and they had invited the whole town to celebrate with them. The barn was decorated with colorful cloth and wildflowers that the children had gathered from the meadow. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by neighbors who had once shunned them. The sound of laughter and music filled the air, a stark contrast to the violence that had once threatened to tear them apart. "The Mama Martha," Ada said, tugging on her dress. "When will Uncle Joseph get here?" "Soon, baby," Martha replied, lifting the little girl onto her hip. "He's bringing a very special present." Chaska approached from the corral where he'd been showing some of the local boys how to properly gentle a horse. His limp was still noticeable, but he moved with the confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "The children from town want to learn more Lakota words," he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Eli's been teaching them curse words." Martha laughed. "That boy's going to be trouble when he gets older." "Good trouble," Chaska replied, using the phrase that had become their family motto. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Joseph Blackwolf arrived with his promised gift. It was a small, leather-bound journal filled with stories that Running Deer had told him about her children. She wrote these down. He explained, hoping that someday you would be old enough to understand them. Ada held the journal carefully, her small fingers tracing the leather cover. "Will you read them to us, Uncle Joseph?" "Every word," he promised. That night, as the last of the guests departed and the children settled into their beds, Martha sat on her porch with Chaska, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked. Chaska considered the question. "I think about what is," he said finally. "We have each other. We have the children. We have a home where love matters more than the color of someone's skin." Martha nodded, understanding. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of hatred and violence. Their family was proof that love could overcome prejudice, that courage could defeat corruption, and that sometimes the most broken people could create the strongest bonds. "Mama Martha, Papa Chaska." Ada's voice called from inside the house. "Will you tell us the story about the church steps?" Martha smiled, recognizing the child's need to understand their journey. Coming, baby. As they went inside to tell their story once more, Martha reflected on the path that had brought them together. Two children abandoned in fear and violence had found safety in the arms of two adults who had been abandoned by their own communities. Together, they had faced down corruption and hatred, and they had won, not because they were stronger or smarter than their enemies, but because they had something their enemies lacked, the unbreakable bonds of a family forged in fire and tempered by love. The story that had begun with terror and abandonment had ended with love and belonging. And in that ending, Martha knew lay the beginning of something even more beautiful. A future where children like Ada and Eli could grow up knowing they were loved, protected, and valued for exactly who they were. The last light faded from the western sky, and the Jenkins Black Elk family settled into the peaceful darkness, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that love, indeed, conquered all. In the distance, the lights of Crow's Landing twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder that even the most corrupt communities could be redeemed by the courage of those willing to stand for what was right. The children were safe. The villains were defeated. Justice had prevailed. And in the end, that was enough.